To live a meaningful life, to really connect with other people, you need to be connected to yourself.
Today's guest is Dr Angelic Nespola, a renowned counselling psychologist. In this episode, we explore important topics like stress, anxiety, and depression, offering insights and strategies for managing these challenges.
Do you think that everyone should at least experience therapy once?
Yes, because if we're teaching our children you can't show emotion, you need to suppress it. That leads to other things later in life. That's where addiction stems from.
This may be a simple question, but how fast is it to cure?
Depression?
Dr. Ange, how would you describe the work that you do, and what is that problem that keeps you up at night that you're solving?
So I'm a psychologist, and that can be quite multifaceted, but I think a big part that I focus on as a clinician is therapy. So that's one-on-one work where we might explore mental health, treating that, or it could just be that people come into therapy to connect to themselves, to get to know themselves a bit better. And I think that's a big shift that we've seen. Previously, there was a lot of stigma around accessing therapy, around accessing psychology. Now we're getting people who come in just to understand their values, to understand what gives them fulfillment, what gives them purpose. So it's quite broad. The need, I think, would depend on where the person is at that point in time. Someone might come in for a mental health reason, but then stay because they want to do some more self-exploration, for example.
For the context of this conversation and the things that we're about to discuss, what's your background and how did you get to this point in your journey?
Yeah, so maybe if I could give some context for the process to register as a psychologist. I think people don't always know that. So you need to have a master's from an accredited university, an HBCSA accredited university. That's our regulatory body. So you need to have a master's. So after master's, I did my internship, and that was in government. I then went on to work in inpatient facility. And then I went into practice and did my doctorate on the side whilst working.
And where does this passion or drive come from? And maybe I'll give you a bit of context for this question. So the more I speak to these influential individuals on my podcast and, just come across these successful people, it seems like it comes from a childhood wound of, and it's not all of them, but it's this needing to prove, needing to validate, needing to essentially become successful because of X, Y, and Z happening in their childhood.
Yeah.
What's it for you? And, did you have any sort of experiences like that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So for me, a little bit of context, I come from a small town called Wilderness. It's in the Garden Route. And I was set on being a lawyer. So that was what I was going to do. I was coming to Stellenbosch, I was going to study law. And somehow somebody connected us to an educational psychologist. They do a career assessment, but a full battery of assessments. So I was like, okay, I'll go, just let's go see what she says. So I went and she's like, Ange, you can't be a lawyer. So she explained it to me. She explained, my value set, because they look at that. They look at aptitude, they look at values, they look at interests, personalities, all of that. So she explained it to me and she's like, you can't be a lawyer. And she presented psychology as an option to me. At that stage, I didn't know what it meant to be a psychologist. I didn't know what degree you needed. I didn't know, how long the course would be, that it's 7+ years of studying. So that's where psychology came about for me. It wasn't a personal trauma I can share with you or anything like that, but that's where I started looking into it and realized that this is the right fit for me. It does align with my values, my interests, my personality, and absolutely, I don't know what else I do. Honestly, I am a trained barista, actually, fun fact. So I can make you a killer cappuccino. Beyond that, truly speaking, I don't know what else I do. I love my job. It's an absolute privilege.
And going into inpatient work, especially at government facilities, I'm sure you've experienced a lot of different kinds of people and come across individuals with, a variety of issues and problems. That experience, what did you learn from that? If you could, zoom out and give us a bird's eye view of what you learned.
In government, I worked in Joburg, and I absolutely loved it. I had no idea what to expect. It's incredibly busy, but it's incredibly fulfilling. People wake up super early to come to the clinic or the hospital. They wait in line for you. They show up for their appointments. They're incredibly committed to their health. So I loved the busyness, but I also saw the need for healthcare in our country and for mental health care. A big thing I was exposed to in my internship was the stigma around mental health. And I think that's not just in my internship. We're still battling that. And that's one of the reasons I do things like this, like a podcast or any other media contribution, is to try and break that stigma. It's getting a lot better. But that was one thing that I realized, and it could be family members of a loved one who holds a stigma, and that can prevent the effective treatment of the mental health condition. So that's one thing that comes to mind as I reflect on it, was the stigma.
Speaking about that stigma, individuals that you've worked with, whether it's your private practice right now or Netcare in the past, those individuals that walk through the door, what was the shame around it? Was it, caring what other people thought about them, being seen as weak?
Look, people can walk through a psychologist's door for various different reasons. So it could be that maybe somebody wonders what their family are going to think if they do access therapy. But I think the problem is not the people who walk through my door, it's the people who don't walk through my door. The people who walk through my door are incredibly brave. They're buying into the process. At least they're trying. They're showing up for themselves. It's the people who are not showing up for therapy that I'm worried about, that I think the stigma is holding them back. And I get it. You don't know what to expect. You're coming into a therapeutic process. It's a stranger. It's incredibly frightening. And I think as a psychologist, I recognize that. I know it's tough. But my worries for the people who don't come into therapy because of stigma or fears or whatever's holding them back.
Do you think that everyone should at least experience therapy once?
Yes. And I'm biased because I am a psychologist, but I do think, if you go on my website, it says something around everybody needs therapy from time to time. And I really believe that. And it could be a short process. For some people come in for a short process, a few sessions, they leave. Maybe they come back, maybe they don't. Some people want a longer process. But yes, I think everybody can benefit from. I'm yet to meet the person who can't. Maybe someone can prove me wrong. I'd be open to that. But that's my opinion.
I guess my next question would be, why? What is it in individuals that we require this support? And then I actually want to, go into early childhood development and the support we are getting there. Do you think that it starts there? And our parents are doing the best that they could?
Sure.
But that most of the problems that we, experience in our adult life come from there.
Yeah, so the question of why, and I'll first answer what came to mind for me first, and then I'll circle to the childhood aspect. Why? Because to live a meaningful life, to really connect with other people, you need to be connected to yourself. To live a life of fulfillment and purpose, you need to understand yourself. There are other ways of doing that. I get that. And I fully support that. But therapy is a beautiful way to connect to yourself, to get to know yourself, to get to love yourself. And that's a journey. Like, if anyone who's watching has been through that, you'll know it's work. It's a lot of work. So yes, there's that aspect. And that's why I think literally anybody can benefit from that. Literally anybody can benefit from talking through your feelings, talking through your emotions, understanding them, understanding the unconscious stuff that you do that maybe feels just like you're going on with life, but there's a driving force there that might be self-sabotaging. So maybe you're making decisions in your life and you don't realize that there's an unconscious driving force there? Maybe you keep going into relationships with people who are going to let you down. What's that about? We can explore that, we can unpack that, and we can shift that pattern. So that's why I say that. Circling to the childhood, absolutely. If there are childhood experiences, that somebody's been through that's affecting their life now, we unpack that. And I think, I'd like to highlight, we know the big traumas. Of course, that sexual abuse is trauma, car accidents, life-threatening illness, being a victim of crime, all of that is massive, significant trauma. But there are other things too that are trauma, and I think we forget this sometimes. The narrative sometimes minimizes these experiences. Being belittled as a child can, leave an emotional wounding. Being bullied as a child.
Not getting invited to another kid's birthday party.
Absolutely. You're forming your identity at a young age. Things like that, which be like, it's normal. Sure, it is. But if those emotions are not processed, they could impact us later in life. The child who didn't get invited to the birthday party might find themselves constantly trying to find value and worth in other people, not in their own, being. So, I think I want to highlight that some experiences in life that maybe are not clinically considered a trauma also impact us later in life. It impacts your emotion regulation, how you perceive relationships, how you perceive yourself, how you connect to other people. Even things later in life. I mean, if you had a partner who was unfaithful to you, that can impact you as well. That too is traumatic. So I think that's something I'd like to emphasize there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's really something that I also had to learn, that there's a scale.
Yeah.
And of course, as you mentioned, those severe things that you go through, those extremely traumatic things, abuse. But then there's also the lighter side of the scale compared to the severe side, which is that perhaps lack of affection, nurture, love, things that we assume or take for granted almost.
Yeah.
What are you telling parents?
Look, and I'm a parent. I know parenting is, it's not easy. I've got all the knowledge in my head. I've read all the developmental textbooks. But being a parent is a whole different ballgame, and I get that. I had to go relook at my textbooks when I became a mom. But really, and we've got all our different temperaments, our different personalities, and each child is different. Each child's needs is different. But if we look at the theory, one thing is clear time and time again, is if you are attuned to your child's emotions, that's attachment. Attachment with your child, that relationship is gold. If you have a good attachment with your child in their earlier years, it helps them regulate their emotions. It solidifies their sense of worth, their self-value. It helps them with resilience later on in life. Attachment comes from being attuned to your child's needs. That comes from recognizing the feeling, helping them make sense of the feeling. Our instinct, and I have to catch myself as well, is to try and stop the emotion. Child cries, you want to give them a sweet, or you want to, but we need to acknowledge the emotion to them. Yes, you can comfort them. Of course, comfort them, reflect the emotion, help them make sense. So when a psychologist speaks about mirroring an emotion to a child, we're saying you're trying to help them identify, oh, you're feeling sad because you weren't invited to the birthday party. Not, don't worry, mommy's going to buy you an ice cream. You can have the ice cream and have this conversation. You're feeling sad because you feel like you were left out and you really wanted to be included. So helping them identify, oh, that feeling, that's sad. I don't need to suppress it. I don't need to mask it. I can feel it. So I think as parents, you need to adjust to the different temperament of your child for sure. And your instinct is something that you must not discredit. But the literature shows us being attuned to their emotions is everything, and it sets them up for good emotional regulation later in life. Because if we're teaching our children you can't show emotion, you need to suppress it, that leads to other things later in life. That's where addiction stems from. You can't show your emotions, suppress, or just throw yourself into work and performance. You can't sit and feel your feelings. You might struggle with relationships, struggle with connecting because you can't show up meaningfully and vulnerably. So it is about teaching them the feeling is fine. What you do with it is important. So You can be angry, sure, but you can't break things or hit someone, right?
I guess my follow-up question to that would be, some parents themselves are not in tune to what they're feeling.
Yeah.
And now they're bringing a child into the world.
Yes, a little human.
A little human that they're responsible for, but they don't even know how to regulate themselves. How does that person now, or don't they?
They should. They should. I think, and often for a lot of people, when they become a parent, they recognize this and they want to work on it. And there are so many ways. Yes, I am going to always preach therapy. That's what I believe in, and I really believe in it. But there are other ways. There are journaling activities that you could do, meditation, mindfulness practices, connecting yourself to the here and now, to understand what you're feeling and regulate. It is something you can learn, yes, and it's something you should learn.
Yeah, we spoke about some of the issues around trauma from the softer side. But I want to go into kind of the cause if it doesn't get addressed at that early age.
Yeah.
Something that stuck out for me was you mentioned relationships. Like you could take that into your adult relationships. What else have you noticed that individuals who don't deal with that early stage trauma, how is it playing out in their adult life?
Yeah, so it's super fascinating to look at some of the research that trauma changes the structure of your brain. Literally, if you look at a scan, you can see someone with PTSD and the structures of the brain that have changed. And of course, that impacts certain things. So emotion regulation is something that could be difficult for somebody with unresolved trauma, for example. The part of the brain, the hippocampus, is responsible for memory. That could be difficult for, somebody with PTSD. So what I'm saying is there are physical changes that can impact certain things like regulating emotion and so on. When it comes to relationships, it depends what the nature of the trauma is. It depends the extent of what it was processed. It really could range. I can give you a few examples, but it won't be a full list. So often there's something about connection that's difficult because of trust. But if it's a relationship trauma, it's very difficult to trust people. It could be an anxiety that the person would leave. It's hard to trust that they're going to stay, and just assuming that they're going to leave you at any time. So that's if there was an attachment in childhood that was not secure, we'd often see that. We call it an anxious attachment.
Okay.
If anybody wants to maybe go read up on it, it's super interesting. We all have an attachment style, and an insecure attachment style would make connecting to people difficult, whether it's thinking that they're going to leave you or pushing the person away before they could leave you. So maybe sabotaging the relationship in a way, and that could be just not connecting. It could be being unfaithful in whatever way. It might be pushing them away because you're so scared of letting them get too close because you don't want to get hurt. That defense mechanism kicks in. It could be trusting people too easily, not trusting healthy people, letting toxic people in your life. There's so many ways that it could pan out, and that's where insight is so important. When I say connecting to yourself, understanding certain patterns, why they play out in your life. Why do you keep choosing the toxic person? Why do you keep going into relationships that don't serve you? Things like that. Understanding that for yourself, because then we can really activate the change.
Yeah. I heard this thing that there's no growth without self-awareness.
For sure. Yeah.
Where does one start on that self-awareness journey?
Yeah, I think thinking, sitting and being honest with yourself, what do you need in this growth and self-awareness journey? Because your need might be different to my need. Is it that I really want to delve into what my values are, or whatever it might be? So what do you need? And then time with yourself. Think about this. The way you would, if you want to connect with somebody, you meet someone in your life, you want to build a connection. How are you going to do that? You're going to spend time, right? So it is spending time with yourself, whether it's doing hobbies, whether it's journaling, meditating, whatever it might be, time with yourself. I also want to highlight here in this journey, your internal narrative towards yourself is so important. And it's important for all of us in every stage. How are you talking to yourself? What are some of the things you're saying when you make a mistake? Are you beating yourself up? Are you being super harsh, super critical? Would you talk to another human being the way you talk to yourself? I think that's something to reflect on in connecting with yourself.
Why do we speak to ourselves in that way? And, say those harsh things where you wouldn't dare say it to someone else.
Yeah. So that's part of the self-reflection. Where is this coming from? Is this the way that other people treated me? Did I hear this growing up or in my life? Is that why I'm harsh towards myself? Or was it maybe part of a high performance aspect? High performers can be super critical, and maybe it worked up to a certain point, and then it became toxic. So maybe they had high standards, they were perfectionistic, and that helped them achieve. It got them to where they needed to be, but at some point that might have changed to really toxic internal narrative. So there's so many different things that it could stem from.
And for someone that wants to change that narrative, where do they start?
I think exploring where it comes from.
Okay.
And then trying to reframe it. And of course, it's an automatic. The way you talk to yourself is automatic, right? You might keep pointing out the critical or the negative aspects, but then pausing, reframing, and shift your focus to the good in you, the good parts that make you you, that make you unique. Try shift away from comparison. If comparison is something you struggle with and it leaves you feeling insecure and it leads to self-criticism and just breaking yourself down, what is leading to comparison? Is it social media? Or are you following certain accounts that bring this insecurity up for you? That's also part of the healing. We got to get to the core, but then also put practical things in place. Like, I'm going to unfollow accounts that bring this up for me, or I'm going to be around wholesome people who see the good in me. That sort of changes can also come, but we do need to understand the wounding. What is the wound, if it comes from a wound? Yeah,
definitely. I think that it's not easy to just lie to yourself and tell yourself a different story.
Yeah.
But I like what you said about switch and focus to what is good in you.
Yeah.
What parts of you are you grateful for?
Yeah.
I think that's such a big thing because, I've read a lot of like self-help books and watched a lot of videos where people say, keep on telling yourself these things and they become true. Well, I know that's not true for me.
Yeah.
I can't just tell myself something and then, believe it.
Yes.
And of course, belief drives behavior.
Yeah. And I love what you said there about parts. And I think that's part of it, is accepting that we as human beings are made of good parts and bad parts.
Yeah.
We're not perfect. There are parts that make us who we are, that bring us value. There are parts we are working on. Sure. I'm not saying we just need to ignore our shortfalls, but accepting that us as an holistic person, I think, the good and the work in progress parts.
Before we go into the effects of it, maybe how would you differentiate stress and anxiety?
Yeah. So stress is something that is linked to a trigger. So maybe you've got a presentation coming up at work, or if you're a student, you have an exam that's coming up, or whatever it might be, something that's coming up. There's an identifiable trigger and you feel stressed about it. Once you've done the project or you've handed in the proposal at work, the stress subsides. Anxiety, there isn't always an identifiable trigger. There isn't an event that's causing that anxiety. It's a pervasive worry that the person sits with. It could be in relation to something. It could be in relation to a phobia, right? Say social anxiety. Okay, but it's a general social anxiety. It's not because, I've got this coming up, I've got to speak. It's a pervasive pattern. There isn't always a trigger, and it doesn't subside after an event. Whereas stress, once we've passed through it, the stress subsides.
Okay. So the anxiety part, where does that come from? Is it also childhood?
It's interesting. So there are different aspects that can lead to it. One of them being unresolved trauma. It could be genetic. There's a genetic aspect to anxiety and depression as well. Chronic stress. I spoke about how trauma can change the brain. Chronic stress can also change the brain. So the amygdala is responsible for your fear response.
Okay.
And through chronic stress and through a trauma experience, that part shifts and it becomes overactive. And that's part of what could trigger anxiety. So anxiety, the cause, very multifaceted. These are a few of the things that could lead to it.
So in terms of the effect of that in your day-to-day life, how is it affecting people with, extreme levels of anxiety?
With the amygdala being activated or hyperactivated, there's this fear of threat. So everything feels like a threat and your body responds. So anxiety, you will feel your palms sweat, your heart beating. It feels like there's an actual threat. But, and this is a sign that it's anxiety, the response is out of proportion to the trigger.
So for that person that, sees everything as a threat or fear, how does that person now perhaps just not view it as a fear anymore?
Yeah, so how do they do the work? So, of course, therapy is one, and there are trauma-informed approaches, and seeing a trauma psychologist would be the main, I'd say, way of doing that. The other way is, if you want to do it, if you want to do work at home as well, is to identify, to I think, acknowledge what you've gone through and the effects of what you've gone through. But trauma-informed therapy is the modality here, because I keep speaking about the changes in the brain. We must also remember that the brain has neuroplasticity. This means that the brain can heal, and this is everything. Like, I think this is why I do what I do, is because we can heal. So your brain has these neural pathways that form, and maybe one of the things that happen with anxiety is you've got these negative thoughts. So I touched on social anxiety, so let me stick with that. Maybe somebody with social anxiety, every time somebody looks at them, they might think they're judging them. So I walk into a space and somebody looks at me, I'm like, they don't like me, they're judging me, they don't think I'm worth, whatever it is, all those anxieties that come up. That's a neural pathway in your brain that can form from various forms of trauma. But neuroplasticity and the research on that tells us that can heal. The brain can form new pathways that become stronger. And I think that's everything. That's the message of hope here, is that the brain can develop new pathways. And that's what happens in practices like therapy, or if you do a cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're trying to, quote unquote, rewire the brain.
Got you. Okay, cool. I want to go a bit more into that, into treatment. So this person, let's use an example of this person has social anxiety.
Yes.
And they step into your room and they're like, Doc, this is my problem. Where do I start? And, what are the steps I need to take to actually rewire those pathways?
So when you walk into a session, your psychologist will do a full history intake with you, because I think we need to understand the root cause, where it's coming from, what does it present for you. One of the ways I mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, that would be a way to relook at those automatic thoughts that come up. So we'll identify them. Maybe one of them is catastrophizing. So every time I have a social event, maybe the person feels like their brain jumps to a catastrophe. I don't know, what could make me think of an example. A catastrophe would be, nobody's going to talk to me, I'm going to be left out, whatever. So we then want to identify, okay, you have the tendency to catastrophize. That's one of your negative automatic thoughts.
So when you say catastrophize, can that be classified as kind of worst case scenario?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And that's one of our negative automatic thoughts. It's a thought that's not rational, but your brain jumps to it very quickly. So it feels like it's going to be no one's going to talk to me. Everybody's going to ostracize me at the social event. I'm going to feel awkward. I'm going to have a panic attack. And, it's just this worst case scenario.
I don't want to divert from what you were explaining, but just on this negativity bias.
Yeah.
Why are we wired towards being more negative than actually seeing the positive?
Yeah, I think it could be rooted in certain childhood aspects for some people. And I think the reason would differ from person to person. For some people, it could be that predicting that something would go badly helped them prepare better in the past. So maybe something served you once upon a time. And sometimes we need to acknowledge that. Maybe it served me. maybe it did help me prepare better for a social event in the past, but now it's switched over into this pattern of catastrophizing. So it could come from something like that. It could be from childhood aspects where there was a lot of uncertainty. You have to try and predict things to try and gain control. Aspects like that.
Okay. Would you say that it's this need for certainty?
Could be, absolutely. But this is the thing about my field and mental health, is everybody's got so many unique aspects from childhood, from adulthood, from personality structures. It could be one of the many aspects. And that's why when you walk into a session with a psychologist, you're not just going to start. You know, as much as I think we do want to hit the ground running, you'll do a full history. We'll look at, you know, development. What was it like in the home growing up? What was school like? Are there any traumas? Just getting a full, because then the psychologist can start understanding where's this coming from and how do we treat it.
Got you. Back to this person with
Back to this
anxiety.
person. So your question, I think, just to recap to orientate my brain, is what do we do? Somebody maybe comes in, they're struggling with anxiety. I was giving the example of social anxiety, catastrophizing. Okay, we want to identify those thoughts, those negative automatic thoughts, saying, okay, catastrophizing is one of the things my brain does, jumps to worst case scenario. How do we reframe that? What is a logical thought? When somebody looks at you, why are they looking at you? And so we think, okay, it's very natural. I mean, if somebody had to walk into our space now, I think you and I are both going to turn and look. We're not going to just carry on blissfully unaware. I like to know who I'm sharing my space with. That is a logical thought. And so we want to rewire that. We want to introduce a new neural pathway. That being said, when we introduce these new thoughts, that other thought's not going to disappear. But I see it as, and I'm a visual person, so I almost see it as like a pathway in a garden when you're walking. If I keep walking this pathway, the pathway becomes more pronounced. So I want to introduce this new, more realistic thought that they're looking at me because they're just interested in who's joining their space. I want to try and avoid this pathway, the thought of it's because they're judging me. So we want to practice that. We want to stop that thought. So it will come up, but you're not going to entertain it. You're going to be very mindful about your thoughts. And then think, okay, let's just pause. Let's think about a realistic, rational thought. Identify that's not rational. It's not rational that everybody who looks at you is judging you. Maybe, I fully accept we get toxic people. There might be some people who do look at you, and yes, they are judging you. But not everybody. That's not a rational thought. So that's just an example of what we would do with the irrational thoughts in a therapeutic space. And then, of course, coping mechanisms. You know, certain tools that might benefit a person.
I think coping mechanisms also has a negative stigma around it.
Yeah.
So, of course, when you speak about coping mechanisms, you actually are putting healthy things in place to cope with that situation. Can you give an example?
When you say negative, do you mean like binge watching Netflix or
alcohol?
Bottle of wine.
Correct.
Okay, yes.
Suppression.
Yes, got you. Yes, when a psychologist is talking about that, I'm not advocating for that. I'm a big believer in meditation. And I think sometimes it's become a cliche, meditation possibly, but I think because it's not fully understood. And I think people are afraid of meditation. We're afraid of just sitting with our thoughts. That's everything we try and avoid as a society, with pills, with drugs, with alcohol, with binge watching Netflix, with emotional eating, whatever it might be. But meditation is just surrendering to the here and now, reflecting on thoughts that come up without judgment. That's really what it is. And some people prefer an active meditation. They prefer running and meditating. Some people prefer guided meditation. Be that as it may, if you're struggling with anxiety, please look into meditation. It is powerful. It is a powerful tool to have to be able to be in the here and now, be mindful and be aware. That's one thing I really advocate for. Breathing. I mean, the science is there. If you can do deep breathing, that's a powerful tool. Another thing is cold water, and people might have seen, cold water therapy. It could just be splashing cold water on your face. It could be holding an ice cube. It shocks your nervous system and helps your nervous system regulate. That's what it's about. That being said, one tool that works for me doesn't work for the next person. So we need to kind of figure out what works for you.
It's interesting you mentioned cold therapy. I think I definitely associate it with recovery.
Yes.
But what you just explained there is what it's actually doing is regulating your nervous
Yeah.
system, which is essentially helping you calm down.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are tools like that, writing, journaling, powerful. Also something that's a cliche, but if journaling's an art and it takes time to practice. So finding, a way to release your emotions, whether it's journaling, whether it's a hobby, a creative outlet, that's also super important. That's a way to regulate emotion.
Yeah, I recently found myself dabbling into creative outlets because I was always like, I don't have time for this.
Yes.
I'd rather be doing something else. But then when you actually do
Yes.
the thing,
Yeah.
And for me, it's music. So
Yes.
it's like literally like mixing or
Yeah.
DJing, but
Yes.
like on a very amateur level.
Yeah.
But what that does for me is like, oh, I'm making my playlist and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, cool, this, and this.
Yes.
I'm like in the zone.
Yes.
I'm in flow.
Absolutely. You're using another part of your brain as well. And I think having something like that where you're not dependent on that for income. This is just a space where there's no expectation. That is the difference. Where you're just enjoying it. You can be in the flow. You can engage in something you love just because. So a creative aspect is so important. It's the equivalent of how a child must play. A healthy child must play. A healthy adult should have some sort of creative outlet. I mean, it can be cooking, it can be baking, it can be music, it can be writing.
And what are you saying to people who say that they don't have enough time for these activities?
I think, look, life is hectic. I totally get that. There's so many demands on everybody. But I think it comes down to prioritizing you. And we spoke just now about relationship to self. This is an aspect of that. And if this should be a foundation, if that's in place, everything else will benefit from it. So if you've had this creative outlet, you're going to be more productive at work for sure. Aspects like that. So yeah, you probably don't have time, but you need to make time. Nobody really has time. We're all very busy. So I think making the time, because seeing it as an investment as well in you, in your relationship with yourself.
Yeah. You only see it for yourself once you experience the thing.
Yes.
Like we can once more read books and learn and, listen to people that, are telling us all these profound things. But once we actually do it and see the results firsthand, like specifically for me, I'm like, whoa, I'm not going to stop doing this now.
Yes.
Because I can see how it's benefiting my entire lifestyle.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, myself included, those things that we really need are the first things that go when we are feeling strained. When time is pressured, you're not going to do your music.
Yeah, of course.
I'm not going to. My outlet is a bit of watercolor painting. Absolutely love it because it's messy. You can just go with it, but it's beautiful and it comes together. I don't do it that's actually when I need to be doing it. So the times where we let it go is actually when we need it.
I think adapting is challenging.
Yeah.
Because we are so, creatures of habit. And so when something is out of place, we then have to, and I'm, speaking for myself here.
Yeah.
I find it really hard to adapt. And I'll give you an example. So it's event season and 3 days out of the week I'm at this event and that's actually throwing off my routine because I wake up at 5 and I meditate, go to gym, get back, have some quiet time and then start working, and that grounds me and that essentially fuels me for the day.
For sure.
But now everything is just out of balance because the event is like 7 to 7 and so, in those situations, what are you telling people to actually adapt to the situation?
Yeah, because we do have times in our life where there is a 7 to 7. Then recognizing what is the need. So you can't do your meditation, you can't do your gym maybe at the moment, but maybe you do need to move a little bit. So you're going to do a stretch. You've got 5 minutes that you're going to do it in. Your need is to move. Or if your need is for fresh air, you're going to quickly do a little walk when you get home. You've only got 5 minutes, you can't go to the gym today, but you're still going to be acknowledging the needs. I think if as people we are in touch with our need and we're able to meet that in a healthy way, that builds a foundation for healthy mental health. Versus when you are just switching off with Netflix, and look, sometimes we do need a little bit of Netflix, but if we're always doing that, what is the actual need? Why are you doing that? Because you're not meeting the need because you keep doing it. What is your need? Reflecting on that. So to answer your question, when we've got so little time, thinking, okay, look, you've got 10 minutes somewhere. What is the need? What can I do within that time to meet the need? It won't be as good as meditation and gymming and my whole morning routine, but I still need to be aware of my needs and not get sucked into the, 7 to 7 and the,
Yeah, what I'm taking from that is understanding your needs and then also micro activities.
Yes, I like that word, micro activities.
Micro activities.
Yeah, and I think we always need to recognize that our needs shift. So yes, gym is important, exercise is important, but maybe tomorrow you wake up and you're really exhausted and gymming and the way that you gym is just not what your body needs today. You need to adjust. Maybe you need a run, or your body wants to swim or a stretch or a Pilates or whatever. Being in touch with your needs and your body allows you to adjust to changing needs. Not that, okay, I gym every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Tomorrow maybe I'm not feeling up to it. I'm a bit run down. It's not what I need, but I'm going anyway. I think we need to make room for that flexibility.
Definitely.
We spoke about adjustment.
I think there's also a fine balance between having a strong mindset to be like, I'm going to do this every day because one, I know that it's good for me, and you have your reasons for doing things.
Yes.
And of course you stick to it because you don't want to break promises to yourself. But then on the other side, it's actually something that I struggled with in the past, which is like finding that intuitive balance to be like, today I need to rest.
Yes, absolutely.
And not beat myself up when I sleep in a bed.
And then saying, okay, I need to rest. What does rest look like for me today? Is it I just need to go to Pilates or do a stretch, or is it I need to take off? I don't need to exercise. That's the intuitive part there.
And what would happen is my mind would then go into kind of a spiral of, okay, you didn't go to gym. Cool, you're not going to feel your best. You're not going to feel your best. You're not going to get enough work done. You're not going to get enough work done. It's not going to be productive.
Yes.
It's not going to be productive. You're not going to make progress.
Yes.
You're not going to make progress. You're going to fall behind.
Yeah.
It goes into this spiral, right? And I've, improved on stopping it.
Yes.
And, being present and actually just using some of the tools that I've learned. But for that person whose mind goes there and, goes to essentially worst case, which perhaps stems from some sort of comparison, because at the root of it, it's falling behind, but falling behind compared to what?
Yes.
Perhaps other people, other businesses.
Yeah.
But, for that person whose mind spirals, what are you saying to them?
So just listening to the little snippet of that scenario, yes, there's the comparison and falling behind, but there's a very deep fear there, I think, that one needs to confront. What is the fear? Because one day is not going to make you fail at your dreams, right? One day of maybe not performing at optimal. If you see it as, okay, today I'm resting so that I can perform better the rest of the week, that shifts it a little bit. Look, if you're taking off gym today and tomorrow and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and next week, you're not really intuitive because, I think then that balance isn't in. But I think acknowledging that, okay, today I'm resting so that I can be at my peak performance tomorrow, versus today, okay, I'm going to keep going, but I'm not performing at optimal level. So, sorry, 2 parts to my answer there. Confronting the fear. There's a core fear there, a very real fear. What is that about for the person? And then shifting the perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you hit the nail on the head. Going into another topic, which I'm sure you've seen a lot of people with and helped a lot of people with, is like being in a super low point in their life.
Yes.
And firstly, I want to know if you could define for us what depression is.
Yeah, so depression is a mental health condition, and what you would see is you would see the persistent low mood. So it's a day in and day out low mood. It might present with irritability as well. Some people don't always recognize that the irritability might mask the low mood. So you're seeing a family member who's constantly irritated. Your mind might not go to depression. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's one of the aspects. Your sleep might be impacted. So you might struggle to fall asleep. You might struggle to stay asleep. You might sleep too much. So insomnia, hypersomnia, your eating patterns could be impacted by depression. A big one to look out for is your areas of interest, things that brought you fulfillment, that brought you joy in the past, no longer bring you joy. And it's not that you've shifted, because we can shift interests. So maybe your one hobby doesn't bring you interest and you shift. It's not that. It's that nothing brings you interest anymore. Things you loved, you just disconnected from. You might disconnect from loved ones, from friends. So those are the key features. Of course, suicide and suicide ideation, thoughts around dying, is also part of the clinical picture there.
Okay. And before we go a bit deeper into that, how does someone distinguish between, and you mentioned a lot of symptoms there.
Yes.
But I feel like now, because of social media, there's a lot out online where people are like, I'm depressed, when in actual fact it might just be a bit of unhappiness. How do you differentiate between perhaps just being unhappy compared to full-blown depression?
Yeah, I think the key feature there is the persistent low mood, that you just always feel low. Your energy is always low. And this is the thing with psychology and mental health being more spoken about. I touched on that earlier. We're more aware of diagnoses like depression, and so sometimes it can be thrown around nonchalantly. Things like bipolar can sometimes also just be, we describe the weather as bipolar. That's not appropriate. So yes, depression is one of those things that people might say, I'm feeling so depressed today. You're feeling sad or down today. Unless it is depression, then yes. So the persistent low mood is the very key feature there.
Okay, yeah, long periods of time,
and affecting your areas of life. So with any clinical diagnosis, so we're talking about depression, your work performance will be affected, or your social life will be affected. Your life is affected by this presentation.
This may be a simple question, but how fast is it to cure
depression? That's very difficult to answer. So it depends on a lot of factors. You do get something like a depressive episode. So somebody had something happen in their life and they're going through a depressive episode.
Due to something traumatic.
Could be trauma, could be chronic stress. It could be burnout. It could just be, life. Maybe there was an illness that they battled and that pushed them into depression, or for whatever reason there's a depressive episode. Yes, that we can treat, that might lift. But a chronic depression might be something you have to deal with long term. It might be a lifelong, like diabetes. It's not just 1 month and off you go, bon voyage. It's something you actively have to manage, and so it really depends on what the clinical picture is, how severe it is. Unless it's an episode, it's something you need to actively treat for the rest of your life, whether it's your medication, with therapy, with your tools that you've learned, continuously being aware of it.
Got you. Let's look at an example. So here is this person that perhaps doesn't feel any sort of excitement towards what they do in the world. So second perhaps is relationships. So they are perhaps not the best person to be around.
Yes.
And vice versa. So they don't really enjoy other people's company. That person comes to you. What are you telling this person?
Yeah. So I think very important when somebody is going through depression, we want to differentiate the person from the diagnosis. So I think acknowledging the experience, empathizing, but you are not the depression, and this is something we can treat, which is the good news, right? The other thing which, if you come to see me and you're struggling with depression, is we'll try and work on aspects that you can re-engage in your life. You spoke about not enjoying certain things, and work, but slowly re-engaging. Somebody who's in a depressive episode, we must understand that brushing their teeth is incredibly difficult. Getting out of bed, is really difficult. Now you want to tell them to go run and think positive thoughts. It's not how we treat depression. So we want to try and re-engage certain aspects slowly to try and combat that isolation, that hopelessness. So that's one thing we try and work on, and exploring the ways that we can do that, what that looks like for the person. I just also want to touch on, because as you were talking through the examples, the first two could also be a picture of burnout, right? Not feeling satisfaction from your work specifically is a symptom of burnout. Emotional detachment that you spoke about there, also a symptom of burnout. Hopelessness, that's where it becomes a picture of depression. That's depression,
Okay.
Not necessarily burnout. So when you come in, we would want to make a diagnosis, and the right diagnosis, and that's where that history is very important, because the way you treat burnout will be different from the way you treat depression.
Okay.
So we'd want to just make sure we've got the right diagnosis, because you might come in and tell me I'm depressed, this is what I've got, and then I'd be like, could it be burnout? Let's explore.
That person who happens to be depressed, what support do they need outside of perhaps therapy?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this question, because I think it is so important. And as a loved one, you just want to help, but you're not too sure what to do. And I must highlight there that what to do would differ from person to person, from what the person maybe needs. I think so. Starting with a conversation around what can I do to help. Listening is so important, without trying to fix, without trying to give unsolicited advice. If the person's asked for advice, sure. But if they haven't asked and they're sharing feelings, and you immediately jump into how do I fix? How do I? That's not what they need. So asking them, what do you need? What can I do to make life better? Or someone with depression might struggle to just get to the shops and get food. So you might say, can I pick something up for you? Can I drop it off? I'm going anyway. Or can I help with the laundry? Little offers like that. If they've vocalized their needs, and okay, they struggle with this aspect, let me try and help. But the big one is try to avoid the fixing and unsolicited advice. Rather go to, what do you need? I've noticed you're not yourself. What is it like for you? You can ask those questions. I think the person will feel validated, they'll feel seen, and if you can allow them to share their feelings, that will allow for the connection.
I think that's such a good point on the advice, and that doesn't just ring true for someone that's depressed. I think it's
anyone.
Relationships in general, right?
Is, yeah.
I do this thing with my partner where we actually have this, say you come home from a long day, so we each have to essentially first give numbers on what our well-being is.
Yes.
So mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. That's the first step. And then the second thing is actually, what do you need from the other person? Do you just need a vent?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
You can vent. Do you actually need coaching?
Yes.
Cool. I'll put that hat on.
Yes.
Or do you just need something else? Just nurturing, self-love.
Absolutely.
And I think
I like that.
we should do that with, even in professional environments, even with friends, family members.
Yeah.
So I think there's a need for us to speak into people's life without them actually wanting it.
Yes, you don't always have to fix things. It's not what the need is. I think I like that. I think that's good advice. The other thing I just want to mention is do research into the diagnosis. If we're talking about depression or whatever the person is struggling with, understand the diagnosis is really empowering for you to support the person, because we often hear things of just think positive thoughts or exercise. Sure, exercise is important, but this is an imbalance in the person's neurotransmitters. This is a clinical diagnosis. Positive thoughts is not going to cut it. And it's very invalidating for somebody who's struggling with depression to be told you need to go for a run. It's also got a tone of blame. So I think if we research the diagnosis and we understand it, we'll be able to validate their experience more and to lean into that role of support.
Yeah, I think at the core of it is just putting in some effort for that person.
Yes.
Dr. Ange, this was incredible. I have some last few questions.
Yeah.
It's called the fast fire round.
Oh, yes. Okay.
If you could make one rule that everyone has to follow, no questions asked, what would that one rule be?
Sure. I think not making assumptions. I'm going to go with that. The way you operate in life, and I know my answer has to be quick, and I don't do quick answers as well, but not making assumptions about people and their lives, suspending that.
So ask questions.
Ask questions, don't jump to conclusions. People have histories that, you have no idea about. We can't make assumptions. And just because you've met one person who's had a similar experience, you can't assume the next person, or because you've had an experience. So yes, I think I'm going to go with assumptions. Not making assumptions is my rule.
Nice. And of course, empathy also comes with that.
Absolutely. I think it's very much rooted in empathy.
What would you like to see changed in South Africa regarding mental illness?
I think if I had a magic wand, I would choose to make it more accessible. We have to be realistic. Accessing mental health care services in our country, it's not accessible. We have a shortage of psychologists. It's not an accessible resource in our country. That would be my first wish, is that we maybe had more psychologists. It was more readily accessible, and financially it was an option to those who need it.
And of course, a place to start is your social media, because you're putting out content there that essentially is accessible. Of course, it's doesn't replace therapy, but for someone that can't afford it right now, it does help.
Yeah.
What's one thing you would say to young Dr. Ange right now?
Ooh, what would I say to young Dr. Ange? So when I started studying psychology, so getting into a master's selection program, most masters take between 6 and 12 people. Your chance of getting in is extremely slim. And that is because training is rigorous, and you're working with vulnerable people, so it should be rigorous. But your chance of getting in is very slim. And I did have people along the way who did say, maybe you won't get in, maybe you should have a backup. I think with the best of intent, but I'm glad that I continued anyway, that I didn't let them discourage me. So I think I'd tell myself, just keep going, just run your race. Accept the care from where it comes, but yeah, keep going.
Got you.
Yeah.
Next steps, what can you share with us? Personally, professionally, what's coming up?
I think this year I tried to do more of things like this, media aspects, for very much the reason that you said earlier. Somebody asked me the other day, why do you do the media stuff that you do? And it's a good question. It was a family member.
Okay.
So I'm full at my practice. It's not that I do these things to get clients in. So they're like, but why do you do it then if it's not for marketing? Because obviously being here, I take time out of my day, I lose income. So, and I was like, this is a good question. So it started with wanting to make it more accessible, wanting to have these conversations. And that was my goal for this year, which I've done a bit more of. And I try to do them as much as possible. To have these conversations, because I don't think enough people are having them. I think I want to talk more about psychology, about mental health. I want to normalize it. I want people to understand, to maybe ask more questions, to go and do research because they heard the psychologist somewhere saying something. So that was my goal for this year. I think I'd like to continue it a little bit into next year. So we'll see where that takes us.
Amazing. Thank you. This was super insightful. Thank you for all your wisdom here that you shared with us today, but also the impact that you're making and the amount of people that you're helping, not just, of course, in your private practice, but, now online and making it accessible. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Cool.